How do you determine what you're doing is right or wrong? What does the right conduct and living a good life really mean? Learn from one of our nation's top ethicists. Why do ethics matter? Next on Living Smart. Welcome to Living Smart, the show designed to help you get the most out of life. Daryl Kane is considered one of the top ethicists in the nation and one of the most prolific writers on the topic. As chair of the Business Ethics Department at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, she lectures all over the country and the world. Today, she walks us through the causes of the crisis we're in and why a professional code of ethics could have avoided a lot of the challenges we face as a nation. Thank you so much, Dr. Kane, for being with us.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
I think also we want to start with just a simple definition of ethics.
Well, let me say, first of all, what ethics is not. I don't think ethics is just a matter of following rules or norms. I would say ethics is more a way of life in which one is self-aware and also aware of the extent to which we are always a member of the community. No man is an island unto himself.
We're all interconnected. Why do ethics matter in everyday life?
Well, I think that if we're not self-aware, we tend to operate on autopilot, and that gets us into a lot of trouble. I've been thinking a lot about unintended consequences, and I think many of those are just the result of us mechanically doing what we've done in the past. So we have to be aware of what we're thinking and whether or not we're just falling into old habits. And I think we also need to be aware of our emotions and what we're feeling, because if we're not aware of those things, we're really at their mercy. We're sort of like flotsam and jetsam on the sea of emotions, and then we're not in control of our life. We're just blown hither and thither by our emotions.
Is that why when you wrote about Dante's hell, what happens is you're not grounded, correct? Can you describe, because you wrote about this, about Dante's hell, and what is the punishment for that?
Yes, I got really interested in Dante's hell because Dante doesn't think that you're punished for your sins. He thinks your sin is your punishment.
Interesting.
So the people in hell are almost all moving around in circles. It's kind of like a neuroses. You know, they're bound in the same pattern of behavior, and they can't free themselves from that. And that's in a way a kind of hell, to be caught in doing the same thing over and over again without being able to get out of it. Right.
Let's talk about this economic mess that we're in. What was it, in part, lack of ethics that we got into this mess?
Oh, I think it was largely a lack of ethics. If you look at the cause of the crisis, you'll see that there was fraud at just about every level. There was fraud on the part of would-be homeowners who misrepresented their income on their applications. There was fraud on the part of the mortgage brokers who didn't really assess accurately how healthy the loans were. There was fraud on the part of the appraisers who overstated the value of the home. So there was really, I would say, largely a problem of fraud at every level that got us into the difficulty. Because if the loans had been good, we wouldn't be having the collapse we're having now.
Why did we get to that point? Is this a cycle, or is this something new in the way we live our lives as Americans?
I think that's a very deep and interesting question. You know, on the one hand, it could be a little bit like some psychiatric phenomenon where people say it's not that there's more of it, it's just that we're hearing more about it. I think the press is a lot more interested in covering ethics. And I know since I've been teaching ethics in 1991, the number of news stories involving ethics has just exploded. In fact, I used to have a little tickler file from Financial Times and Wall Street Journal. Every time something appeared having to do with ethics or fraud, I would get an email. I turned it off, Patty, because there were so many. I just couldn't deal with it. So I think that we're hearing more about it, but I also think there's more of it.
Okay. Now, did easy access to credit play a role in all of this?
Oh, sure. I mean, people...
And was that part of an unethical behavior on the part of the companies that were allowing this easy access to credit?
Well, yes. I think the banks and the brokers did not do their due diligence as to who was really applying. But we also have to remember that for several different political administrations now, we've had people interested in expanding home ownership. And I don't think we really thought through who was truly going to be able to afford a home. And there are a lot of expenses. You know, I was talking to a student, and she said, oh, well, I can make the down payment. I said, but can you pay the taxes? And can you set aside money every month for, you know, if the air conditioner breaks? And we're just not educating people as to what the real costs of home ownership are.
Again, it goes back to lack of consciousness and awareness, right?
Yes, that's right. And people are overly optimistic about their ability to pay for things.
Now, you talk a lot about, when you talk about ethics, you talk about anxiety and how anxiety may cause you to be unethical. Can you sort of elaborate on that? I find that very interesting.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that anxiety is a kind of general uneasiness. It's different from fear because you're afraid of something specific. For example, you're afraid of spiders or afraid of the heat. When we're anxious, we just have a kind of general malaise or unease, and we're not exactly sure what we're concerned about. And I think a lot of anxiety stems from us getting over-identified with a role. We think we're just a role, and then if our role gets threatened in our eyes, we have no sense of who we are anymore. I mean, I don't know if you've been following the aftermath of the Bernie Madoff scandal, but one of the things that happened was there were a number of suicides.
Right.
And I asked myself, what are the suicides about? And I think that in many cases, the suicides were caused because people saw the amount of money they made as a definition of who they were. And then when they lost all that money, they thought, oh, I'm not a man anymore. I'm not someone who's worthy of continuing to live. And I think that there you have a case of anxiety. The people were afraid of a kind of non-existence, of ceasing to be who they were.
Why do they get to that point? And this goes back to be ethical, you need to know thyself.
Right.
Can you tell me about that? Because you're talking about our identification as humans.
Right. Well, I guess, knowing thyself is kind of a paradox because it's a lifelong journey to find out who we really are. It's not something like you suddenly know. But I guess I'm saying on the negative side, one thing that knowing oneself means is knowing that one is not simply a role. And I think that it's interesting that most of the suicides have been men, perhaps because they were more invested in data, but they identify more with their roles, what I think. And women have a variety of roles as caretakers, volunteer, professional person, and I think that gives us a series of outs because we have other places from which we can get value in our life without saying, oh, I'm only a professor, or I'm only a newscaster, or I'm only a PBS interviewer. We have other sources of self-esteem.
Yeah, I'll play the guitar.
Exactly.
Unethical, though, you talk about how Americans tend to be now are much more anxious than before, and therefore they're more unethical situations. Again, why are we more anxious as Americans, and that's leading to these problems?
Right. Well, I think in part we've begun to push our children to become successful, and we don't even state anymore what being successful means. I mean, successful at what? There were some very interesting studies done of some Ivy League schools that showed that students coming into the colleges had no idea what they wanted to study. And in a way, that's no surprise, right? When we come out of high school, we don't really know much about what interests us. But what was really kind of chilling about the study was when they interviewed the students after graduation, they had no better idea of what interested them than when they went in. So part of what's happened is the parents have said, build your resume, build your resume, build your resume, without letting the children discover what they're really interested in. And I think in part our colleges have failed the students by not teaching the classes in such a way that students can really get some kind of purchase or some kind of idea of what their vocation
what their passion is.
What their passion is, right.
Okay. You're a business ethics professor, besides just general ethics, but is this a crisis in capitalism, what's happening now?
Well, it's hard to say if it's just a crisis in capitalism. I mean, there certainly was a lot of fraud involved in the communist systems in the Soviet Union and China as well. I guess I think that there's been a kind of wake-up call, that the old idea that you simply use laws to create an even playing field and you rely upon people's integrity, I think we are seeing that may not be enough. And I think the reason it's not enough is because the regulations per se do not help people deal with anxiety. And if people people have to choose between abiding by a rule or giving up their sense of who they are, they'll choose breaking the rules. I'm sure about it. It's a little bit like why, according to psychologists, narcissism is the most difficult condition to treat. I mean, it's considered basically untreatable, is what I understand from psychiatrists, because the narcissist has built this shell around himself or herself with a kind of role or a kind of sense of who he or she is. And the person will stop seeing the psychiatrist before they'll let that shell be cracked. And I think that all those books about the narcissistic CEO and the narcissistic executive those books are suggesting that we've become quite narcissistic, and I think it has to do with what we were discussing earlier, the anxiety.
As
and
a society, we become more narcissistic. What did the founding fathers say about ethics and government?
Well, the Federalists famously said that if we're not building a regime for angels, but for men, and that if statesmen were always at the helm, we wouldn't have to worry. But instead, we need to construct a system in which self-interest balances against self-interest. Right. The problem with that is, what do you mean by self-interest? And if you mean ego interest or false sense of self,
yeah.
then I don't think self-interest is really going to balance self-interest very well. You may have a lot of people with a false sense of self who collude. I mean, that's basically what we saw in the mortgage crisis.
Right.
So you don't get the kind of balance you need. If you mean by self-interest people who are doing what I call their soul work and really trying to figure out who they are and what their passion is and what kind of contribution they can make to a society by pursuing that vocation, then you do have a better chance of self-interest combating self-interest, I think.
So if you live more authentically and you know what your passions are and you're doing what you love, you tend to be more ethical? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so, because I think people find more joy in what they're doing. I mean, another way of talking about the distinction between ethics and morality, or between finding who you really are and simply following the rules, is to talk about the difference between intrinsic value and extrinsic value.
Right.
Extrinsic value means you find your worth through ratification by other people, or by people saying, "Oh, you've been a good boy or a good girl. You've adhered to the rules.
Or you make tons of money.
Right. So that's all external validation. But intrinsic worth, intrinsic joy, means that you find a kind of satisfaction in the activity itself, and it's a kind of hard idea, but I think that good is more intrinsically satisfying than bad. Have you ever seen the movie with Bill Murray, Groundhog's Day?
Yes.
It's one of my favorite movies, because you see that what happens is that he's caught in this cycle. He has to keep reliving Groundhog's Day over and over again. And he starts out as a really kind of nasty, cruel, alienated man.
Right.
But he finally discovers that being nice is actually more fun than being mean.
Right.
So he gets bored with evil, is a way of saying it. And I think that's kind of a profound insight.
We need to get bored with being unethical and evil and greedy. And that leads to my next question. Greed played a role in this. Why do we get greedy?
Right. Well, I guess it depends upon what you mean by greed. I think that most moralists understand greed as a desire for more money. I would say greed is an attempt to convince yourself that you're really alive. It's a kind of overreaching where one's continually looking for some kind of validation that you are as a person and that you have worth. And if we're not finding any kind of intrinsic source of that validation, almost by definition, we're going to be living in a kind of greed. Right. And I think, Patty, there's something else interesting that's going on. In my generation, your generation, our parents' generation, people's material aspirations were largely set by their peer group, and those were people they lived with. So if the people down the street whom your parents knew got a television set, your parents could reasonably aspire to a TV set as well, because you knew you were living among people of the same sort of socioeconomic group, and the people knew each other in the neighborhoods. But now what's happened is the peer group reference has changed, because people no longer know their neighbors. Many people's material aspirations are being set by what they see on TV, and they're looking at the lifestyles of the rich and famous. They're looking at all these beautifully designed homes, and people are saying, "Oh, I want that," or "That's available to me. If so and so has it, I could have it too." And I think the expectations are really unrealistic, because the TV representations aren't grounded.
They're not real.
They're not real. They're not real.
Or they're real for very few people.
Right.
Not the masses of people.
Right.
You also talk about ethics and our physical addiction to adrenaline, which, by the way, also leads to another problem, adrenal fatigue. But why do we as Americans have this problem with adrenaline? What's going on?
Well, there have been some studies of people on the trading floor, and of course many traders or people who have compounded to the mortgage crisis that we're in now. And it shows that, the studies show that when people begin with a good trade, they make money, they have a kind of hormonal kick-in that makes them even more confident, which means they take bigger risks and ever bigger risks. So our hormones tend to be sort of self-ratifying, and you can think of a hormone as a potential source of a bad habit, I guess. And conversely, if people have a bad initial trade, the hormones kick in such a way that they think, oh, I'm lousy, I'm a loser, and then they make another trade that they don't think through, which tends to not be a good trade, bad trade. So you get into these vicious, self-confirming cycles. So I would say that even something that's, as biologically basic as hormones really has a kind of ethical import.
Now, you talked also about buying safety and control. We want to be in control. We want to be safe. What does that have to do with ethics?
Well, it has a lot to do with it. I mean, on the one hand, if we're not aware of the fact that we're anxious, we can't do anything about it. And if we're not aware of anxiety, then we're at the mercy of anxiety, and we get driven hither and thither in our decision.
Which is the hell that you're describing,
right? So, I'm not saying that the quest for some control of our life is illegitimate. On the contrary, I think it's crucial to long-term happiness. But I guess I would say that we are more in control if we find intrinsic satisfaction in our life, because we can control the intrinsic satisfaction. If I take joy in playing piano, I can pretty much play the piano whenever I wish. If I make my happiness contingent upon getting certain awards or living in a certain neighborhood, those things may not be under my control. So then I've actually lost some control over my life.
Now, some people think being ethical means being moral, but it is not exactly the same thing, is it?
I don't think it's the same. I distinguish it, and many philosophers do. Moral, as you know, comes from the Latin word for mores, which means a series of rules or norms. It even includes things like etiquette. And those things are important for creating an identity in the community, but they're not enough, because you really need ethics. And I understand ethics as this way of life. It comes from the Greek word to have or to hold. It's your bearing in a way. It's how you hold yourself.
Being grounded?
Kind of being grounded, right? How you hold yourself in, throughout your life. And I think that holding is ultimately more important than just following the rules, because the rules may not be applicable to the situation in which we find ourselves. The rules may themselves be perverse.
Unethical.
Right, exactly. Or immoral.
Immoral, too. Segregation, for instance.
Right. So we need to be thinking about whether or not these are rules to which we should adhere.
Right. Now, you studied also a little bit about terrorism, and you said that a lot of terrorists have something in common. Tell me what that is, and what does that have to do with ethics?
Well, I think that there are two things they have in common. Oftentimes people are quite ideological, so this has to do with this narcissistic shell, identifying oneself with a position. And people, again, would rather die than give up their position. So people who are willing to die for an ideology are quite dangerous. The other thing that I was really struck by was I heard a National Public Radio interview with someone who had looked at the profile of terrorists, and it turns out a disproportionate number of them are handicapped or disabled. And I thought that's extremely interesting, because what that suggests to me is that if people are shunned by their own society, and if they're not given any help in finding intrinsic value, then they really are left with nothing. They have no intrinsic worth, but they're not getting any extrinsic validation. So I think that they literally are people without selves.
Right.
And
desperate.
Desperate.
You talk about one of the things that you consider a very important virtue in your ethics classes, and that is resilience. Tell me about that, and how does that cure a lot of our problems?
Well, resilience is a kind of stick-to-itiveness and ability to bounce back, and there's definitely going to be setbacks in life, but if you're resilient, I think you're more likely to find your inner calm and to give yourself time and space to think about what it is you really want to do.
Again, going back to knowing thyself, part of that process. You also studied, besides terrorists, you studied shopaholics. What can shopaholics, and I have family members who are, not me, of course, what can they teach us about ethics?
Well, I guess what's interesting about the shopaholic is, first of all, that the person thinks he or she absolutely needs some particular item, and oftentimes
to be happy.
So oftentimes that's caught up with a kind of image. If I don't have jewelry by so and so, then I'm a failure or no one will like me. But the other really interesting thing is they've done studies of people's reported satisfaction after purchases. And people prior to the purchase of the BMW or the expensive diamond necklace forecast that their level of satisfaction will shoot up dramatically.
Right.
But what happens is, and they forecast that it will plateau off then at this higher level, that they'll be much happier. But in reality, what happens is people make the purchase. Well, they anticipate the purchase. Their happiness level is going up, up, up. They make the purchase. Then they don't stay happy very long. Their satisfaction immediately drops down, and it goes lower than it was prior to the purchase.
Yeah.
Right. So that's where you get the aholic part, because people who don't identify that dynamic then think, oh, I need another purchase. So you get into another one of these vicious cycles.
So it just doesn't make you happy.
It just doesn't
Again,
make you
going
happy.
back to thyself and having that intrinsic value within yourself, not depending on other things.
Well, it's a matter of knowing the difference between what you need and what you want. And, we really need to teach our children the difference between the two. And I think we're not doing a very good job of that. And the children figure out very quickly that that there is a difference and that they need to blur it. I mean, I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
I was in my kitchen, and my niece was much smaller at the time, and I had gotten myself a popsicle. And she came into the kitchen and said, "Oh, Aunt Daryl, I need a popsicle." And I said, "Oh, you don't need a popsicle. You want a popsicle." And she said, "No, I need that popsicle." So, she is
They use that a lot, don't they?
Yeah, she's 3 years old, and she's already figured out that needs are somehow more significant than wants. And that she's more likely to get the popsicle she wants if she characterizes it as a need. But, if children who are 3 years old understand that needs are more important, in a way they're on the right track. But in another way, we don't help them because we continue to blur this. And as adult, we talk about needing all kinds of things that we don't really need at all.
We don't really need. Yeah. What about, you spend a lot of time also talking about how Americans are sort of addicted to extreme sports, extreme things. Why is that? Is that part of the not knowing thyself and, addiction to adrenaline?
Right. I think that the speed racing is definitely an addiction to adrenaline. And some people, when they interview the young men who are largely involved in speed racing, they say that they feel like they're leaving the earth. I mean, it's some kind of desire to escape existence, to actually not be on the surface of the earth at all anymore. That's kind of striking. And then, if you look at other violent things, like there have been studies of hooliganism, soccer hooligans in Europe. Yes. And what you find out there is that the people say that they do the job during the week to earn money so that they can travel around Europe and get into fights. And that the men report feeling alive only when they're fighting. And they've turned their hooliganism into its own sport because they keep a score, not about the game on the field. They keep a score as to how many times the press mentions their fights during the subsequent week. So the different clubs of hooligans actually have their own competition going on. And there you have, again, a kind of illustration of what we were talking about earlier, a desire for extrinsic validation, that only if they're on TV do they think that they
have
are.
Worth.
Yeah. It's a little bit like that Nicole Kidman movie where she's the weather woman.
It's the weather girl,
yeah. Right, that she has to be on TV to feel like
she's worth something. What does ethics have to do with Americans consuming a disproportionate amount of the world's resources?
Well, I think that we consume too much because we don't understand the difference between needs and wants. And I think also because we're caught up in different kinds of, shopaholic dynamics.
Right.
We just buy stuff that we don't need. I mean, one of the fastest growing businesses in America today is, guess what? The storage unit business. So let's think about storage units.
Stuff.
So the storage units, we pay money to have storage units to hold stuff that we're attached to, but we don't even need because we don't have it in our house. Right? It's in the storage unit.
Right.
And people report not even remembering what's in their storage unit. So to me, that's a kind of indictment of just where we are.
Now, what do you consider a moral hazard?
Oh, a moral hazard? Well, I think when economists use the term, they usually mean that a policy or a group of legislators is creating an incentive for people to act in ways that will cause violations of norms down the way. So, for example, some people say that if you let banks merge with each other, you create a moral hazard because the banks begin to think they're too big to fail.
So, which is sort of what happened.
Well, it is in a way sort of what happened. But look what we're doing. We're creating even more huge mega banks. That's something that concerns me. But there you would have a kind of case of a potential moral hazard.
How do you know you're living smart?
I guess I know I'm living smart when I'm aware of what I'm feeling and when I don't feel a lot of anxiety, when I feel pretty calm about what I'm doing. When I've done my soul work. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, I thank you so much, Daryl Kane, for joining us. It's great. And boy, I've never learned so much about ethics as I have with you. Unbelievable. To learn more about this topic of ethics, go to our website. There you'll also find a complete resource list. You can also email us or call us with your comments at 713-743-8513. That's 713-743-8513. And that's our show for today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Remember to live smart and ethically. I'm Patricia Gras. Have a blissful week.
For a transcript of this program, send $6.95 to the address on your screen. Please include the name of the guest.